critical mass and we can get started.
Sure. Usually we start 3 minutes after the hour, and I believe we are there. So, um, I think now's a good time to start. I've started all the streaming, so um,
Okay,
yeah.
excellent. Well, good morning to everyone. If you're on the West Coast, good afternoon. If you're on the East Coast, and if you're somewhere else, welcome to our Terasaki Talk. It is a great pleasure to welcome Professor Karp to our discussion. I have an announcement before we get started. Unfortunately, Dr. Ali Khademhosseini cannot join us today due to a last minute emergency, but Jeff and I will hopefully fill the discussion in an enlightening way. Um, so, for those of you that do not know Professor Karp, he is the author of this fantastic book called Lit Life Ignition Tools. He is the distinguished chair at Brigham Women's Hospital. He's a professor at Harvard Medical School. And he is a prolific innovator. And in his innovation, he's almost legendary for using a concept called biomimicry, which I will ask him to explain in a little bit. So, Jeff, something sprung in your mind at one point and made you want to write a book about lit. And I
Yeah.
gather from reading the book that lit is not only um, a great reading and an innovative sort of approach to one's personal sort of life journey, but it was very important to you yourself, and it may be part of why um, of how you became such a prolific innovator. So you talk about being in a lit state, which you describe as taking yourself off autopilot and living to your full potential. Can you maybe tell our audience what you mean for all that and expand on it?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation to connect here today. Great to see you again, and hello to Ali. I know he's kind of in that traveling snafu, and yeah, I've actually been getting all kinds of emails today because the hospital system, it's incredible, right? Like how much we rely on digital technology, and hospitals are unable to do any elective or non-urgent surgeries today, across the United States, maybe even broader. I'm not sure, but pretty amazing.
Yeah, we thought we didn't have single points of failures, but I guess sometimes things sneak in.
Yeah. Actually, hold on one quick second because I have a dog here who wants attention. In 1 second, I just need to
No,
tell him.
no problem.
All right. Okay. There we go. Just needed to let's see. But yeah, no, so speaking of lit, to me, lit is really all about it's about intercepting patterns, and to actively think and decide versus just jump in with habitual responses. And I think, there's so much of our day, our patterns or habits, or I even like to think of it as algorithms. It's sort of like the foods that we eat, how fast we eat, the tone of voice that we use with certain people, how we direct our attention during the day, how we tap into our curiosity, how we lead with curiosity, how we cultivate creativity, and so the choices that we make and the thoughts that we have, and how to really, I think often we're subjected to $900 billion per year in marketing and advertising. That's a B, 900 billion a year is spent on marketing and advertising to hijack our attention and kind of serve us what others deem important. And I think that what happens kind of in this digital age is that a lot of the patterns and habits and algorithms that we lead in our lives are not ones that we've intentionally put into our lives, or they're not necessarily ones that we've been evaluating to determine whether they best serve us. And I think we all need tools and strategies and rituals and practices that we can experiment with to develop awareness of these patterns and to change things up, and to make sure that we're constantly gaining fresh energy and aligning with our true intentions and connecting, kind of coming into alignment with what really it is that we want to be doing and how we want to be acting and behaving. And so that's really what lit is all about. It's like a series of on-ramps to help people to become aware of patterns and then intercept those patterns. And just to go back to something you said just a moment ago, so, actually the story behind how the book actually got started, an agent contacted me from New York who was interested in some of the work that we do in bioinspiration, turning to nature for inspiration. And I was so really interested in writing a book about it, but I thought about it for a few days and I realized there was something even more sort of burning desire inside to write about. And that is how early in my life I struggled with ADHD and learning differences. I didn't know it. My parents didn't know it. My teacher certainly didn't know it. And boy, did I struggle, early on. I was a C&D student for many years in elementary school, but with the support of my parents and a couple, 2, 3 kind of key teachers, I was able to develop tools and strategies initially to survive, but then eventually to thrive. And so that's really what I wanted to write about. And so I told the agent, this is what I'd love to focus on, and she agreed. And so that's how Lit was kind of born.
Fantastic. And you said a couple of times, and it's certainly throughout the book, this sort of sense that life should be lived with a sense of purpose. That it's your action should be deliberate, as opposed to, as you pointed out, reactive to the $900 billion worth of influences. And I guess for nowadays the social media crowd and everything else that may be trying to direct our life. And as innovators, it often reminds me that when you're looking at sort of virgin ground of research, being deliberate about what you intend to do and what problems you intend to solve and where that sort of spark for innovation may be coming is often a secret to success. So, some of the outcomes of being lit, according to the book, is redirecting one life toward a sense of purpose, and that in turn, could expand your creativity, your connection, your passions. Can you sort of explain the connections between creativity, maybe innovation, and this sort of sense of purpose that you speak of?
Absolutely. Well, I think one of the key things that kind of brings it all together is one of the greatest technologies that all of us have available at any moment throughout our entire lives, and that's the ability to ask questions. And in multiple points along my career and in my personal life, I have realized time and time again that the ability to question is actually a skill, and that we can refine that skill throughout life to get better and better at asking high value questions. And as I've sort of looked around the community, of researchers and sort of questioned and looked at who does the highest impact research and how is what they're doing different from those who might be doing less impactful research. And what I've always kind of come back to is that the people who do the most impactful research are the ones who are asking the highest value questions. And it's not about, someone necessarily being smarter than someone else or having more resources or more access to tools and things. It really comes down to the questions that we ask. And generally, I'd say most Nobel Prizes that are won, in medicine and physiology, in science, it really comes down to the questions that people have dedicated themselves to asking and to, kind of going on an adventure to find answers and develop insights. And so I quickly realized in my life, and I really think it connects exactly to your question, which is that I think it provides the link between curiosity and creativity. And I'll give you a couple examples that I think illuminate that. So I think that, well, first of all, when I was younger, I realized that my attention was all over the place, like pretty extreme ADHD. And but I also developed a really deep awareness that anytime I asked a question, I would be able to hyper focus on the answer for a few moments afterwards. And whatever was said in those moments would imprint into my mind. I could connect it to other things that I knew, and I could recall it later. So questioning, I quickly realized around the second or third grade, was something that I needed to use as a survival tool in school to learn, because it just learning in the classroom setting just wasn't working for me. And then if we kind of so my whole life has really been about questioning and trying to figure out how to ask better questions. We fast forward to University of Toronto. When I entered graduate school, I was about to learn a whole new level of question asking that would also help me unlock creativity. And so what happened was, like all academics, I would go to these seminar speakers, that would come in once every couple of weeks, once a month. And I would sit there and kind of doze in and out and not really follow. But something really struck me, which was at the end of when the speaker finished speaking, the question and answer period, it was like the arrows started to fly, and people in the audience would just ask questions that would cut to the heart of what the speaker had just spoke about. And I was blown away, like just the energy behind those questions and just how important they were. But at the same time, I was thinking to myself, why aren't these questions coming to me? Like, I'm not thinking of any of them. And I started to almost like shame myself, like, why, what's wrong with me, And so anytime that I've found that I'm not good at something in life, or I don't have a particular skill, I've sort of learned to realize that it's not an inherent absolute scenario, but rather it means I just haven't engaged the right process that works for me. And so what I did was I started thinking about pattern recognition. And so what I did is when I went to the next seminar, everyone was focused on what the speaker was saying, but I was focused on something completely different. I was focused on the questions that people were asking at the end of the seminars, and I wrote them all down. I literally wrote all of them down. And I would go to seminar after seminar and just write the questions down. And after 2 or 3 months, I sort of paused and I started to look over the questions and just sort of look at them. And, I feel sometimes it just takes like a little bit of time to approach something multiple times to let your mind sort of sync up. And after a few days of looking at these questions, it was like a light bulb moment. Boom. I realized that every question that was asked could fit under 4 or 5 different categories. So there were questions that people were asking about, was the experiment set up properly? Like, was there something wrong with the experiment, right? Some experiments are really complicated. Did they have the right controls to show that the experiment was working? Many times, the experiment actually wasn't working well. Like, you can find faults in the experiment, which then, kind of compromise all the data that was generated. So that was a big group of questions. Another was, are the results important? So you might find like someone's presenting a diagnostic for blood, but they've done all of their results in saltwater saline. And the results look fantastic, but they haven't tested it yet in the complex system of blood. And so the results aren't important yet, right? I mean, they're encouraging, but they're not. So we have to be careful. There was also a category where often, and this happens more times than I think people would like to admit, but the speaker will overstate the conclusions, that the data doesn't actually support the conclusions that are made. And so there's questions around that. And then there's questions around statistics and, some other things. And so by recognizing the rationale behind the questions that we're asking, I now understood why people were asking those questions. And so the next seminar I went to, it was like I had my detective hat on. I was like taking notes the whole time. I was looking for holes. The questions that others were asking are now coming to my mind. And not only that, this is where creativity comes in. I was able to take what the speaker was saying, and because I was curious, I was tapping into my curiosity, I was able to connect it to other things that were in my mind. And I started to come up with ideas for what the speaker could do next. And so to me, like, questions are one of our greatest technologies as humans, that we can use our consciousness to explore, that can help us to tap into our curiosity. And when we do that, we're able to tap into creativity. And so I think, like, I deeply believe that curiosity Questions are a skill we can develop. Our curiosity we can tap into more and more as we develop the skill of questioning, and then that feeds into our creativity. And so that's been a big part of the innovation model in my lab. And one more thing just to say on that is there's one question I've learned through this process to ask at every single lab meeting, which is, what's the bar that we need to exceed to get everybody excited? In other words, it's like, what's the best result that anybody has achieved in a particular model? And how much better do we need to do to excite our colleagues, to excite potential people in pharma or biotech, or whoever it is, investors, the community? And to me, it's important to make that, it's sort of like the so what question, to make that the North Star of every project. And I think, to me, that's one of the ways that we can differentiate an exploratory project from a true translational project. And there's other elements of that, but to me, that's one of the key things, is that we need to have a North Star, and we need to show that we can go beyond what someone else has done. So just a quick example, like, one of the areas we work in is cancer therapeutics. So we might say, okay, what's the best result in a particular model? Maybe it's 30% of the animals survive for 4 months. And so the question is, if we showed 50% for 6 months, is that good enough? Or do we need to go to a year? Like, it's not always clear what to land on, but through engaging in that discussion, we can have better clarity of what the goal of the project really needs to be. And then you're thinking of the key functional endpoint very early on in projects, and everything ties into that. So it can actually help make decisions about what experiments to perform, what experiments not to perform, and how to kind of go about it.
This, is really fascinating. And this sort of notion of questions, the right questions, especially, being a critical tool that ultimately connects to innovation and creativity and all the other things you said. Two things strike me as you sort of talking. One is how important it is to ask the questions, yet how intimidating often is, especially for younger researchers, academics, early career folks, to actually ask those questions, especially in group settings. So one thing I wanted to ask you is, how do you facilitate nurturing the questions and the proverbial notion that there is no dumb question? Or maybe there are some dumb questions, but you don't want to penalize people asking questions. Maybe you want to coach them. And two, this idea that the questioning process, and really most of the other tools that you put into lit, which ultimately drives sort of innovation, is a learned skill. It's not necessarily a gene that has been inherited that makes you a great question asker. So maybe can you talk a little bit about both, and how, again, your personal experience, or how you're mentoring your teams to be effective in both?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that, well, one is, I think that all of us have been shamed at some point in our life for, as you said, asking the dumb or the stupid question. And whether it was a teacher or a family member or a friend, or, whoever it was. And the problem is that imprints in our minds. And so it actually leads to hesitation. So anytime that we're in a setting and we have a question come into our mind, then we hesitate to ask that question, because we have this imprinted sort of negative feedback loop that we might be shamed, if we say something that others deem a non-important question. The problem with that is that I think that, kind of like creative expression, the questions that come into our mind are very pure. It's very it's sort of like a natural curiosity process. So I really don't think that there are any dumb questions. In fact, I found even, in my lab, when I ask the simplest questions, like, we might all, decide to work on a certain project, we start moving ahead, presentation happens at lab meeting, and then I'll say, well, why are we doing this? What's like, and sometimes people will be a little shocked to like, why are you asking such a simple question? And I thought you knew why we were doing it. But it's almost like sometimes these questions we need to ask because we have to, with the new insights and the new information experience we have, we might think about things a little bit differently, and we might sort of realign where we're taking the project. And so even though we may all be on the same page, we have to ask those simple, basic, fundamental questions as well. And so one of the things I think that's really critical to consider is that if we don't ask the questions, like not only has being shamed prevented us from asking questions and created hesitation, but it also prevents us from developing the skill of asking questions. And so often what I find when I'm in a conversation, my questions get better the more questions I ask. Because as I ask a question, I'm listening for the response. And then, so it's almost like I found a way to get comfortable asking questions where I know the question may not be the highest value question to start with, but I have confidence that I will be able to get to a higher value question through engaging in just starting by asking the first question. And so I think what we need to do is we need to develop cultures, and this is one of the things I've tried to do in the lab, where we encourage people to ask questions, even if those questions are not the super high value questions that we're all seeking, because we have to understand that it's a process to get there. And it's not important that the first question asked wasn't the best question. What's important is that we're all developing our skills to ask better questions, and that these questions are evolving, over time. And so to me, it's not an absolute one question or the other. It's more of like a series of questions, and how can we get better at asking these questions? In some ways, it's almost like a flow diagram, like it's like you ask a question, you listen, and then it kind of, helps you to figure out like, okay, should the next question be this or that? And, you start to kind of piece things together. I think it's just kind of how the human mind works. So I think it's really important for communities to cultivate environments where people are comfortable asking questions, and also to focus more on not any single question that's asked, but more the evolution of the questions that are asked, and how, as we listen to responses, we can improve our ability to ask, higher value, deeper questions.
Very interesting. And I'm just curious, as you sort of reflect on the generations of students that come through to you, say from the undergraduate programs and then eventually into the graduate programs, do you feel like the students are learning to ask questions, or is that sort of a new skill that you have to almost teach once people come into your lab?
Well, I think there's a whole spectrum. It just depends. There's different experiences people have. There's different confidence levels people have. Different education systems. We've had people from over 30 countries in the lab. And so, people have different education systems. There's different sort of cultural practices and sort of ways of being and things. So people may ask questions differently, or, their process for questioning might be different. And so it's very sort of individualistic, I think, in terms of, but what I like to do is create an environment where people are encouraged to ask questions, create an environment where we're all seeking to ask higher value questions. And I think by doing that, and one of the ways actually that I've tried to cultivate this in the lab is we do something called 3-minute presentations. And we've done this for years, often, once a year, twice a year, sometimes even 3 times a year. But what happens is everybody in the lab gets together, and the mission or the challenge that's presented is to put a 3-minute presentation together on something that you're curious about, and ideally not related to your science, like the projects that you're working on, just sound like a passion of yours or as curiosity, something you're interested in learning about, and take risks in the presentation, in terms of the introduction, the conclusion, the props, whatever it is. Take risks, do something you haven't done before. And then what happens is everybody presents. We have undergrads, grads, postdocs, doctors, some junior faculty even. Everybody presents. And then at the end, people, you can't ask questions about technical questions. What the goal is to provide feedback, to kind of say you could ask questions or provide feedback on what you liked about the presentation, what you thought could be improved, this kind of thing. And then at the end, everybody votes on who gave the best presentation and who gave the best critiques and feedback. And that actually cultivates, so it's been incredible. We had somebody present on, they created a permaculture effort in their backyard. They had like 250 different plants, and many of them were edible, and they found a way to just convert their backyard into that, which was really fascinating. Somebody played a guitar and they had slides going in the background. Somebody was really into breakdancing, and they talked about it, and then they did a breakdance in front of everybody. Somebody made a burger rap, a rap about like the burger restaurants they really like in the Boston area. Like, people just did all kinds of interesting things. And the amazing thing is that, you have high school students and undergrads and postdocs who are all giving each other feedback, right? And we're encouraging people to give feedback, and people are incentivized to give feedback. And that, I think, really helped to create a more a lateral environment, where people could listen to each other and sort of break down the hierarchies. And to me, that's important for kind of creating that community where people are not afraid to provide critiques or to ask questions and, break down those walls and the barriers. Because my sense is that, a high school student could come up with the best idea for a project. And we need all the minds, like, all the power of diversity, diversity of thought and diversity of experiences and access to tools and things. And we just, we need people to just be thinking about things from different angles. And I think hierarchies can really disrupt that in a negative way. And so it's important to break that down and make people feel comfortable about contributing in their own unique ways.
It's fascinating. And some of it, I was thinking, some of my own experience where sometimes the best questions are asked by the people who, quote, know the least about the subject, because they are bringing a beginner's sort of mindset, and they're not constrained yet by what, quote, is right or not. Do you find that to be true in sort of your sentence?
I have this book. Actually,
okay, perfect. Yeah, I was thinking of that book as I was saying this.
Hold on, the background. I'm going to take out my background here. Sometimes there we go. That's better. Here's the book that I have on my desk.
Yeah. Exactly. So do you actually find that in sort of driving your scientific and innovation, it is often the out-of-the-box thinkers that may not know too much or may not yet be constrained by what they know that come up with the most thought-provoking questions?
I think it certainly contributes. I mean, in my experience, it's sort of like when you have usually one person cannot come up with the best ideas alone, just in my experience. I haven't really seen that. But what I have seen is a group of people who are communicating, and, different thoughts are being expressed, and then maybe somebody in the group then processes what's been said and then suggests an idea that is, involves lateral thinking and, kind of contributes in a unique way. But I think it's important to consider that that sort of came out of the discussion with a diverse group of people, right? And so to me, everybody in that group was contributors to that idea being generated at that moment. And had that person not, had the person been alone, they probably wouldn't come up with the idea. So to me, I think and I think that ideas, again, I think that the high value, really exciting ideas come from like leveraging or harnessing the power of diversity and having people who just, have had different experiences and think differently and have, have knowledge in different disciplines. And again, then having the community, the sort of the environment, the culture where people are comfortable discussing, having open discussions. And I think that, the people who tend to be focused on developing the skill of asking questions are the ones who often come up with a lot of the ideas.
Yeah. And it's an interesting concept, this sort of interdisciplinarity that really is looking at the diversity of skill sets and science and disciplines, and maybe the intersect of those as the key places for innovation. Now, that's a good segue to the other sort of big tenet that I'm picking up in your book, which is sort of the role of nature and you're suggesting that as part of this process of becoming lit, we really need to be inspired and be close to nature. You
Yeah,
want to talk a little bit about that? And obviously your work has been heavily inspired by nature. So I love to
yeah.
hear also how you've seen this translate into your actual work.
Absolutely. Well, I think, first of all, I think it's important to sort of to consider or think about that for tens of thousands of years, we were hunters and gatherers. We were outside working hard all day to survive, and we were submersed within nature. And so to me, everything comes from the earth, right? Everything you look around, even you look at your phone or you look at, kind of anything, the book, like everything to us, like we're all from the same place. And I think that we tend to lose sense of that in today's sort of, fast-paced culture. And I think that there's almost been, for many years, we had to develop strategies to survive because nature, is wild, and there's a lot of things that can, bring us disease or shorten our life, or these kinds of things. And so we needed to develop strategies to survive with nature. But I think we've kind of gotten today to this point where we're so extreme in isolating ourselves from nature. Listen, I mean, we're born in hospitals, buildings like that are have HEPA filters, right? Like, so we're sort of keeping out all the bacteria and the microbes, and then we get into our cars, and then we go home, and then we go to our work, and majority of our lives are spent in environments that are all pretty much sterile. And I think that, and then the other sort of aspect of it is that in nature, things are constantly changing. Things are growing. Things are, are growing towards the sun, growing towards the light, and moving. And, if you do a time lapse of any sort of natural environment, there's a lot of movement that's happening. But yet in the structures that we live within, there's like, if you look at the wall, it's not changing, so it's sort of like, we spent tens of thousands of years subjected, outside, and it's part of our wiring to really pick up on all the nuances and things that were changing around us, and to develop all sorts of skills and be working, using our bodies constantly to survive. And now we're sitting in, chairs in these buildings where not much is changing. And I think that's had a really negative effect on our mental health. Like there's, it's massive numbers of people today have anxiety, depression, loneliness. It's an epidemic. Was coined an epidemic, and not to mention obesity. And so to me, I think that one of the solutions to all of this is to, as individuals, to think about how we might reconnect with nature, because there's so much evidence right now, that scientific evidence that supports, like, when we go into nature, it switches us from the sympathetic to the parasympathetic nervous system. Our heart rate comes down, our blood pressure comes down, our breathing rate comes down, our overall sense of well-being goes up. And there's factors that are released from living things that we breathe in, and it impacts our biology in very positive ways. And so, or even like seeing a sunset or looking up at the night sky, like all of these things can bring us sense of awe that can produce all kinds of positive neurotransmitters. And so it's there for us to access. And I really also think that, like, exercise is a form of us getting in touch with our own biology, because when we exercise, we also release all sorts of positive neurotransmitters, like, dopamine and serotonin and all kinds of them. I mean, there's a long list, right? And so all of these things we can tap into. Another thing is, like, I cut my finger like a few months ago, and I just, like, it was pretty deep, and I put a Band-Aid on it just to see, like, okay, maybe I probably should go for stitches, but let's see what happens. And a month later, it's like perfectly healed. And just to sort of pause and think, like, wait a moment, like, that's nature. Like, there's this life force that exists everywhere in the universe, through the cosmos, and in us. And we have this incredible healing, regenerative capacity. And so to me, I think as we sort of develop, I think it's important for everybody to have a strategy or a process for engaging nature, because it just can add to a much more fulfilling life. And I think it could really help prevent a lot of these mental health issues that we're seeing today in society.
And that's, at the root of, I think what I pick up from your book is a sense of that doing all these things, including leveraging nature and your contact with nature, does ultimately create a healthy mindset and really a sense of optimism. And that is fueling that curiosity, that sort of makes you smile as you're going through the quest of being a scientist or a researcher, in this case, with high creativity. I'm also curious because you're using nature as a scientific strategy to sort of, in your work. And I'm curious if that is connected to this sort of sense of going to nature, or if it was just your strategy that then you connected to the mental health aspect of it later. And I would love to have you share with your audience some of the approaches you have to this sort of bioinspiration, biomimicry, and some of the success stories you've had in doing that, because that's a very, I think, promising but unusual approach to the scientific process, I think.
Yeah, so when I was in the third grade, my family, we moved out to the country, and I'm talking like literally, like there was a farmer's field in our backyard. There was a sheep farm beside us, buffalo farm across the road. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, there'd be a pack of wolves on my front lawn. We had a creek that ran across the property, and there was like crayfish and snapping turtles and leeches and minnows and, all kinds of stuff. It was really, really incredible. And so I would get off the bus from school because, now I'm out in the country, so the school's a little bit far away. And, I would feel exhausted, trying to fit in the day, trying to assimilate, trying to figure out like, what just happened and how can I really, fit into what's happening. And as I walked along my driveway and, there were no cell phones back then or anything like that, I would just, my driveway was 1,000 feet long and it was carved through a forest. And so I would just look at the trees and the animals and, just everything around me. And I just felt this kind of solace. I started to develop a deep connection with nature. Now, fast forward to when I was in Bob Langer's lab doing my postdoc. One day I was sort of walking around the lab late at night and, kind of doing some experiments, walking back to my desk. And I just sort of looking around and I saw a picture. Someone had a journal article open on their desk with a picture of Spider-Man, the action figure, that was sort of hanging from a ceiling. And so I went and I looked it up, and it was actually like in a nature journal. And what the authors had done is, by understanding how geckos can walk up walls and hang from a single toe, they created a dry adhesive tape that mimicked this hierarchical, sort of geometrical approach to tissue adhesion. And they were able to show in their key experiment that they could get Spider-Man to attach to the ceiling, with no glue, no suction cups, anything like that. And so I was just fascinated by that. And the wheels started turning, and I started thinking like, wait a moment, maybe this could be used to develop a tissue adhesive tape. And so that was really my entry into the world of bioinspiration. And I think one of the reasons I was so drawn to it is also because of the nature sort of exposure that I had when I was younger. And so what happened was we started to, I applied for a grant to the NSF, which was funded. And then I was able to recruit some people and develop a team around this bio-inspired, sort of project. And as I sort of ventured down that road into tissue adhesives, I started meeting with doctors and hearing about all kinds of problems, and realized that we needed to develop other formats of tissue glues and things. And so one of the things we did is we looked at, Dr. Pedro Del Nido, the chief of cardiac surgery at Boston Children's Hospital, reached out because he wanted to help treat children who have septal defects, holes in between the chambers of their heart. And so we started to work on something, but nothing was working. And so that we find is a good time to turn to nature for inspiration. And we sort of said, okay, well, what creatures exist within wet dynamic environments? And we looked far and wide at all kinds of creatures, in particular, sandcastle worms that exist on rocks in the sea, and the waves are hitting them, they remain put, to slugs and snails. Sometimes you'll see a snail on a leaf and it's raining, it's not falling off. And we discovered some things that these creatures have in common in terms of how they attach under wet dynamic conditions. And we brought that into the lab. It infused fresh energy into the project, and we were able to create a tissue glue that could literally seal a hole inside a beating heart. And we've since got regulatory approval for this glue for vascular reconstruction in Europe. And we're in 2 clinical trials right now, one for sutureless nerve reconstruction, and one for tackless hernia repair. So not using the typical fixation, just the glue is the mechanism of how we're achieving adhesion. So that's one of the bio-inspired kind of approaches. And one thing I think that's just critical in all of this that I think connects to lit is that turning to nature is a way to intercept patterns. It's a way to sort of say, wait a moment, how we approach problems becomes kind of linear over time. And we sort of lose, we think we're being creative, but we're not really being as creative as we could be. And so to me, turning to nature is a way to get our minds out of the typical strategies that we use to problem solve and to think differently. And also by thinking about nature, it starts to fuel a lot of the things that we spoke about before. We've done trips to the aquarium and the zoo and, things like that, which I think, people in the lab really love. And so the bio-inspired projects are multifold. Not only is it helping us to solve problems, but it's also helping us to connect more deeply with nature because we're thinking about nature more in the workplace.
Very inspiring. So in the last remaining minutes, I really had 2 questions lingering, which I think in part you've already answered in everything you've told us so far. But sort of focusing you more directly to an institution like the Terasaki Institute, we are obviously aspiring to be innovators around a variety of big problems. And this sort of process of innovation is something that challenges us every day. How do we become better innovators? How do we become? How do our people sort of increase their innovation quotient, for lack of better words? And I'm curious what advice you would have to an institution like ours in terms of trying to institutionalize the kind of things that you've been describing. And of course, that's beyond, requiring the reading of your book as a mandatory statement, which I would highly recommend. But just any thoughts about how institutionally this sort of lit process could be adopted?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, well, for one, one of the things about Lit, the book, is that it's not prescriptive. It's not like it says, try this, or this will work, this is going to work for you. I feel often it's very personalized. And so people can try different things and find what really works best. And that's what I would think as well for like an institution like Terasaki. I mean, I think what you're doing is incredible. And there's a lot of amazing projects that are being conducted and advanced towards companies. And, so it's already happening there, which is really amazing in such a short time from when the institute started. And I think that to me, a lot of it is just about, well, the culture, for one, is sort of cultivating a culture where people, where it's not linear, where people are sort of like, it's all based on evolution and experimentation, and not just research-wise, but in ways of thinking. I think that also having examples like people who are translating, like bringing in the translators of the current day, maybe even, across demographics, and bringing in those translators to have a seminar series and give talks about their translational journeys. And, I feel like that can cultivate a community. I think anytime somebody has a win, and it doesn't have to be, getting something on the market, but, getting something into clinical trials or having a company formed or a license, really celebrating that, and sharing it and disseminating it and showing that this is really highly valued, within the community. I think also really cultivating an environment where people can ask questions and not have hesitation or fear around those questions. I think another thing is really what I've realized is one of the big challenges in biomedical innovation is problem definition. And I think often problems are not solved because the definition of the problem is not broad enough. And so to me, I almost think of like problems as a Venn diagrams. And so we often just think of the biology problem or the medical problem, but there's also the patent problem and the manufacturing problem and the regulatory problem and the reimbursement problem. And so to me, it's important for the community to have a deep appreciation that the problem goes beyond what we typically see in academic papers. Because if you can't get a patent, then it's going to be really hard to help somebody. If you can't, and then if we can understand what the clinical trial is going to look like early on, we can figure out what's the comparator need to be, and then we can include that early in our experiments, make that the North Star. So I think in some ways, it's important to sort of figure out like how are we in these communities that are trying to be innovative, pointing the North Star of the projects. And I think it kind of also comes back to that question of like, what's the bar we need to exceed to get everybody excited, and making sure that the goal of the project isn't so easy to just create new technology. It's really hard to create technology that actually solves a real problem, that advances beyond what's currently possible. And I think that a lot of the work that's being done in the biomedical community is more exploratory. It's not translational, but it could be translational if we really thought more deeply about the North Star for each of the projects, and sort of making sure, like, it's sort of like it's almost like thinking at the beginning, what's the killer experiment we need to perform to show that what we have is better, and how much better do we need to do? And when you think about that early on, you might iterate that and evolve that over time. But I think it's important to think about that super early and sort of create a community where people are constantly reevaluating that and sort of helping others to define that.
And I think that really dovetails to your message of setting a purpose and being deliberate, because I see sometimes people engaging way too early in experimentation, and they can't answer the question of what it is that they're trying to solve or to achieve with those experiments. And I think that's excellent advice. John, if you're listening in, do we have the ability to take questions from the audience?
Hey,
Maybe he's on.
yeah,
Yes, hi.
don't see any at the moment. I can prompt the audience with questions.
Okay, yeah, if we could do that in the remaining few minutes. Otherwise, I have a final question for Jeff.
Sure.
And you've been sending this message, I assume, to a wide audience now as a result of the book. How is the book being received?
Yeah, no, it's being received really well. So it's led to a lot of opportunities at a number of book launches that I've done. Actually, children with ADHD were in the audience, and at the end, they asked me questions to help them through some of the struggles, that they're going through. So that was really kind of special. And yeah, no, I recently also became a contributing author at Psychology Today through the book. So they listened to some of the podcasts that I had done and were interested in some of the thinking and processes and thoughts, that are covered in Lit. And so I just published my first article there last week. So yeah, lots of really interesting, exciting things happening, and I think to me that's also one of the key sort of parts about lit is to do new. That's actually one of the chapters, one of the tools is do new, to make sure that we're always sort of finding ways to do things we've never done before. And it can just be really exhilarating and bring in fresh energy that can have a domino effect in our lives and really help us, you know, in many ways.
Well, fantastic. I know that the audience must have questions because we talked about the importance of asking questions, but I'm not seeing them coming through on the chat, and we're coming to the top of the hour.
Oh, we did
So,
get one through the
oh, okay,
Q&A
I'm sorry.
feature. Are you
Okay.
able to read it? Mauricio, it's in the
Um,
Q&A feature.
okay, I am looking. Is it in chat? Oh, I see. It's right there. Okay, perfect. So the question is, what books do you recommend to read to have a better understanding about looking at the North Star during research?
Wow, great question. I'm not sure which books to read. I'm sure there's probably a lot out there. Something I'll definitely consider and think more about. To me, one of the ways that I would think about it, just personally, is sort of looking at the sort of the entrepreneurial academics who have been moving a lot of technologies out of their lab, and trying to go to seminars or look up some of their talks on YouTube, or connecting with them or people in their lab in some ways, and really thinking, sort of trying to figure out questions to ask to really understand their process of how they choose which problems to work on and how do they pick which experiments to do. So I feel like we can figure this out by asking questions and sort of thinking about, you know, the process. And sort of, I think we have a tendency to go to speakers and sort of just listen to what they say. But I think it's important for us also to have a strategy of coming up with questions that can further some of the ideas or thoughts or things we want to get better at. And so I think that's one of the ways that we could do that.
Excellent. Well, your idea that asking questions becomes a process is paying out. We have another question.
Super.
Dealing with ADHD myself, do you have any thoughts on how to start approaching nature as a way to calm myself in the hustle and bustle of everything? Question mark.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I think that generally people with ADHD can have extraordinary experiences in nature. Often people with ADHD can hyper focus on things in ways that others may not do or as often. And so spending time in nature, I think, just really brings out a lot of superpowers that people with ADHD have. One of the things that I do now as I walk the dogs that are behind me, one has just had a sneeze attack that is now gone, thankfully. But what I do is when I walk the dogs around my neighborhood, and you don't have to have dogs to do this, is I cycle through my senses. So I'll actually say sight, and I'll look at the texture of the bark on the trees, and I'll look at the tops of the trees and the shape of the clouds. And then I'll say hearing, and I'll listen for the birds, you know, the calls that they're doing to each other, and I'll listen for the sound of the rustling of the wind in the leaves. And then I'll say touch, and I'll feel my heels hit the ground. I might slow down. I'll feel the clothes on my skin and the wind against my face. And what I'm doing is I'm focusing in on individual senses and connecting to nature. And that has many, many interesting effects. And not only is it deepening my connection with nature, it's actually deepening my own nature, my senses. So I'm resensitizing my senses. I'm resensitizing my aliveness. So I think, you know, our senses are how we experience the world, and they get desensitized over time in this digital age, where we're not fully utilizing all of our senses. The other thing I'll do is I'll actually close my eyes when I'm eating for a few bites, just to focus in on taste, because we tend to, you know, we tend to be sort of like with our senses, you know, we have stimuli coming in from all angles, And this is a way to focus in on individual senses and to connect, and then to think about when I'm eating, think about all the biological processes that have to happen for the nutrition, the nutrients to get into, to get to the cells and things like that. So I think there's a lot of ways that we can connect to nature, through our meals, through our walks outside, and it really doesn't take time away from anything that we're doing.
Fantastic. We have 3 minutes left on the stated program, and we just got flooded with a series of questions. So I don't know if we're going to be able to get to all of the questions, but we will document the questions and send them to Dr. Karp, and maybe he'll be kind enough to give us responses to forward to people. But I'll read you the next one in the hopper. Would you please make a comment on the idea that imitating nature does not always yield the best results? For example, the discovery of flight. I agree that nature has a lot to offer as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, the way I look at it is that it's not like we're looking at nature and asking for the exact solution, at least in the work that we're doing. We're just looking for ideas that can help us along to the next step. And so, for example, we were developing a tissue glue, and when we looked to nature, we realized that there was like the hydrophobicity of some of the components of the secretions that we were seeing in nature was really compelling. And it was something we weren't thinking about significantly at the time. And so that sort of changed how we thought about things. And so to me, it's not so much about mimicking what we see in nature. It's just about uncovering new ideas. And those ideas ideally are ones or insights that you wouldn't get had you not gone into nature or thought about nature. And so I think that with any project, you need insights from many different places. And nature's just something that can expand our minds and the possibilities of ideas that we might, kind of consider. So that's how we typically think about it.
Terrific. I will send you the other questions that have come through. Again, as a reminder to everybody, the book is Lit Life Ignition Tools. I believe it's available widely on all the usual channels. And Jeff, thank you so much for making yourself available. This has been inspiring. And I know from some of the questions and comments that a lot of the audience is finding this very inspiring.
Excellent. Well, thank you for the opportunity. So great to connect today, and yeah, looking forward to hearing receiving the other questions and thinking about them and responding.
Terrific. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and stay tuned for additional Terasaki talks upcoming.
All right. Thank you.
Take care.